Hi, third graders! Today we're going to read chapters 11 and 12 of George's Marvelous Medicine. Chapter 11 is called Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant stewing pot had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvelous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at $10 apiece. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George cried. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." Here they are at the breakfast table. He's so excited. Let's see if his idea works. "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with my cornflakes," cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from the chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is make one more stew pot full as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the pot as you did yesterday. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hooray and build a giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You'll see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," cried Mr. Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything's empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set. Flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" Here they are. They're going to the laundry room. They're going to see if they can remember everything that George had put in the marvelous medicine. "I don't think so," George said. So they went down to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mess of the stuff you've used," he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" "No, Dad, it's not," George said, and he led the father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put in anything else. Mr. Killy Cranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on his list. Then he went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. "Now, show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together." Here he is. He's got all of his new medicines and all of his new supplies, the bottles and the cans. Let's see if George can remember. We'll have time for one more chapter today. Chapter 12 is called Marvelous Medicine Number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big stew pot was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss Hair Shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pot. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail polish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed all the things into the stewing pot. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the pot didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the pot, and George stirred the mixture with the same long gold wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work, at least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killy Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the stewing pot. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right color." "It's boiling," Mr. Cranky said. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right," shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give it to a chicken." "My heavens alive! Why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down?" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world? Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the pot and get a spoon, and we'll give it to a chicken just to make certain we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvelous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt and in that silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvelous medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken, chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with brown specks on its feather looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went, peck. Here he is, giving the chicken a little bit of medicine. Let's see if it works. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. Whoosh! Shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. And then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer, and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. Here's the chicken. It does look like it has stilts. Oh my goodness. "Oh, my sainted ants!" cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you've left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What is it you've left out?" "I got it," said George. "What was it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it. Then that's the answer. Wait a minute, said George. Did we have brown shoe polish on our list? We did not, said Mr. Cranky. I used that too, said George. Well, no wonder it went wrong, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to the car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Here he is running. All right, tomorrow we'll read the last 2 chapters. I will see you guys then. Bye.